Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, How to Plan, Prepare, and Execute Your SQL Server 2008 End-of-Life Initiative. My name is Nick Wilson. I'll be helping to facilitate today's session. Before we get started, I want to share that we will save some time for questions at the end. Should you have a question, please type it into the chat feature of your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll ask as many of those as we can to Steve at the end. Those we can't get to, we'll follow up after the webinar. Also, we will share a recording of this webinar at the end as well. With those few housekeeping items out of the way, I'm happy to introduce our presenter today, Steve Greer. Steve is an associate architect and SQL Server thought leader here at CEI. He's responsible for our team mentoring and knowledge sharing for the Microsoft SQL Server platform. He is a Microsoft certified professional with over 10 years of experience across areas such as designing, developing, testing web-based apps, and custom databases. Steve is based here in Pittsburgh at our CEI corporate headquarters and delivery center. With that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nick. So welcome to everyone on the phone. We won't be able to hear you, but we do appreciate you joining us today. So let's get started. So the agenda, we're going to do a little bit of background on why end of life is the way it is, and then we'll go through what are the options. So the key takeaways of the presentation today is we want you to have as much information as you can get in an hour to prepare you to move off of SQL Server 2008 or to move to a place where SQL Server 2008 is fully supported. And so in order to do that, we're first going to talk about the options for moving, so the solutions that are available. We'll talk about our approach, how we typically tackle migration efforts. And then we'll talk about how we can move forward together if you would like us to assist you with your initiatives. And we'll end with, like Nick said, with some Q&A. So let's get started. So Microsoft products fall under sort of a 10-year cycle. So the first 5 years are going to be mainstream support. The next 5 years are extended support. And so for 5 years, you get new features. And then for the 5 years afterwards, you get a window in which you can plan and execute migrations to move to the next fully supported version. And after that 10-year period, everything that is currently not up to snuff in those products, or anything that is an identified issue, vulnerability, bug, what have you, will be that way for the foreseeable future. They are not going to continue with security patches and with other updates. So looking at Windows Server and SQL Server, which are sort of the main topics for today, extended support, which is that second 5-year window, ends July of this year. So after July, if you continue to use SQL Server 2008, you would use it in an unsupported fashion. So it would not be getting security patches. Any vulnerabilities that were found would exist forever. So let's just we're going to focus mostly on SQL Server today. And we're going to run through, these are some of the life cycle for SQL Server. So this gives you a picture. And again, I'm going to move a little bit faster here. This is all information that's readily available for anyone that's been working with SQL Server for a long period of time. These are the types of things that you kind of adopt and see as a pattern. So you can see the dates and how versions have been cycled out. And so we're now at the threshold here for 2008, where 2008 is going to be end of extended support. And so your options, again, for SQL Server to move forward, we'll talk about later, but you can see the next few SQL Server versions and when they are extending as well. So if you are planning to move to a new instance of SQL Server, if you choose to 2012, you'll be looking at another migration effort in 3 years. If you go to 2014, that buys you about 5 years. And then 2016, you continue to get more and more time. And so you're going to be in the same boat that we're in today, where we're talking about a migration effort. And I'm going to pass through this slide pretty quickly. This is a really good synopsis of the features that have been added to SQL Server over time. And the reason we wanted to show this is that there are a lot of things that have been added to the SQL Server platform since 2008. So alongside of a migration, which puts you into a supported environment, you're also going to be getting new features and feature improvements. And some of the feature improvements that do not require any functional changes are going to be related to optimizations. So there's a lot of optimizations in here that are going to be performance benefits moving into new versions of SQL Server. So let's talk about what the options are for moving, because that's kind of this and the approach for moving are the key focal points of the presentation today. So these are sort of the three buckets for solutions that we've identified. So we can be looking at rehosting SQL Server. We can look at re-architecting SQL Server, which means moving into a platform that does not use the traditional SQL Server on-premise server install. And then there's also the standard upgrade pattern where we can move from SQL Server 2008 to a newer version that is supported. And so there's benefits to each of these. There's costs to each of these, and we'll kind of highlight some of that today. So for rehost, the reason that rehost is an option is specific to this end of life. Microsoft is extending some free security updates to SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2 when they're hosted in an Azure VM. So that means if you pull them out of your data center and you put them in an Azure VM, from a Microsoft perspective, the supportability of that instance is better. You're in their data center, their threat detection and other back-end infrastructure upgrades that you get enable them to sort of for free offer these this extended support. And so this is the support that you can also pay for an on-premise SQL Server, but it's quite expensive. So that's a really excellent offer from Microsoft. And that's relevant for the folks on the phone today. If you're still considering moving off of SQL Server 2008, depending on the volume of servers you have and the complexity, you're probably looking at a timeline crunch getting moved into a new supported version by July of this year. So let's talk about re-architecting, because re-architecting is sort of the new thing that's available now. When SQL Server 2005 hit end of life, we didn't have the ability to move into the Azure platform and get some of the SQL functionality without the traditional overhead. So let's talk about the options you have in Azure. So these are the three SQL Server platform offerings available in Azure. So Azure SQL Managed Instance is going to be the closest feature version. So this feature set that's available in Azure SQL Managed Instance is very similar to the feature set you get with an on-premise SQL Server. The benefit of an Azure SQL Managed Instance is that it is a fully optimized environment. It runs in a cluster. It's highly available. And it's served to you as an instance from a platform perspective. You're not going to be provisioning VMs. You're not going to be setting up always on clusters. You're not going to be doing a lot of the back-end administration that's required to have a highly available SQL instance. You're going to get that essentially for the cost of the managed instance service. And where this is usually the best approach is when you're using features that are not currently available in Azure SQL Database, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is closer to your on-prem SQL Server from a functionality perspective. And so this is, again, it's something if you are looking to migrate and your organization is already in Azure or is looking at a future state that involves cloud services, I would highly recommend a lot of research into Azure SQL Managed Instance, and even going so far as to spin up an instance, throw your application out there and see if it functions as is, or using some of the tools we'll talk about later to evaluate what features of SQL Server you're currently using to see if that's feasible to migrate. So that takes us to the second option, which is Azure SQL Database. And this is the fully encapsulated database as a service that Microsoft has. And this is available in Azure. You will get a database instance. So you will not get the full instance. You will get a single SQL Server database, and it's very scalable, and the cost is very low considering what it takes to spin up a production-ready on-premise SQL Server. And so this is not full featured. A lot of the platform offerings have some features removed because the concerns that those features are tied to are going to be managed by Microsoft on their end. So in Azure SQL Database, you don't have to worry about hardly anything other than tables, the database specific objects. Everything above the database at the instance level is something that's abstracted for you, but it's also taken care of for you. So you can get easy scalability. You can have 30 days rolling backups that you don't have to schedule. You just have to open a ticket. You can move backwards in time to any specific day. And you can automate some of that as well if you have a process where you need to respond faster than a ticket supports. So it's a really, really excellent service. Whenever I'm doing any kind of development or testing, I always use an Azure SQL database to start with because it's that easy to work with. So for your production-ready applications, there is a migration effort. This is why we put this in the re-architect platform, the re-architect group, because it's not as easy as picking up your existing SQL Server databases and moving them into Azure SQL Database. That part is that easy, but how you manage, how you monitor, how you respond to incidents, and all of the back-end processes and documentation you have in place to meet your SLAs are things that you would want to revisit moving into Azure SQL Database. So we've lumped it in with re-architect, not because the functionality at the database level isn't supported or isn't easy to transfer. It's because there's a lot of other concerns around a production application that you would want to take into account. Then finally, Elastic Pool, which is a collection of Azure SQL databases that are going to share some back-end resources. And really what you get with that is the ability to share costs. So the cost model in Azure is based on resource consumption. So when you're sharing those resources across multiple databases, you're going to be sharing that cost. So for example, if you have 10 databases that you have to spin up individually as Azure SQL databases, you can put all of those in an Elastic Pool and pay for the pool, not necessarily pay individual fees for each database. The reasons for moving between Azure SQL Database and Elastic Pool are mostly centered around cost and around usage. And we can look at those at a later point in time. Evaluating if you would like to move to an Elastic Pool or if you should move to an Azure SQL Database or an Azure SQL Managed Instance would be part of what we would call our assessment phase if we were going to assist you. And I'll outline what we look at and the tools that we use for the folks that aren't looking for an outside partner, that are looking to do this for themselves. So in a little bit of a bigger play, most of what we've talked about so far will work for a data warehouse environment if your data warehouse is in SQL Server. However, there are a lot of other benefits you can get for re-architecting your data warehouse. So Microsoft has published a modern data warehouse architecture, and it looks similar to this. And it is an excellent architecture for leveraging some high-end analytics services. So Azure Analysis Services, which is the replacement for on-prem analysis services, and machine learning through Databricks or other advanced analytical workloads, which would run either directly against your Azure SQL Data Warehouse or from a Databricks notebook. And so you can kind of see here that the modern data warehouse has various phases, and some of the key points to this are moving through storage to get to your data layer. So moving from wherever you have your data through the storage service, because the storage service loads into Azure SQL Data Warehouse are highly optimized. They can run in parallel. It's very quick, and it supports a lot of other uses. If you're staging your data in storage, you can consume it both in Azure SQL Data Warehouse and through Databricks. You can manage the life cycle of that data from a data factory pipeline, and everything ties back into Azure Active Directory, so your access constraints can cross the entire architecture. You're not looking at a separate set of security services and a separate set of principles for storage and for data warehouse and for analysis services and for your Databricks. So it's kind of a different way to think about data warehousing. And I just wanted to include this slide because if you're moving and you're evaluating a migration effort, it is the time to look at what other benefits that you can get from making a shift to some of the more modern services that are available. So this takes us to rehost, which was moving your on-premise SQL Server to be hosted in an Azure VM. So what we've talked about so far is taking a database out of your on-premise SQL Server and making the database available inside of Azure in another environment. This migration solution is taking your instance out of your on-prem server and hosting that instance in an Azure VM. And so you get a lot of benefits. You can go with various operating systems. There's a high level of tuning done between the server OS and the hardware options that are available. You don't have to look at matching all of the various hardware options that you would need to do to spin up an on-prem server or to put several blades together to pull a data center. You can look at just browsing the available options for a VM and selecting what meets the best need per application. And then the VMs are excellent for hybrid solutions because they can be set up inside of a VNet, which is an Azure entity for extending a network around Azure objects. And you can actually have those routable from your on-premise domain directly to those VNets. So you can set up VPN pipelines. You can do things like use an on-premise DNS server to route to an Azure VM and really make the experience to your development and your production team seamless moving into Azure infrastructure. And finally, it's sitting in their data center, so all the traffic in and out is part of the advanced analytics that Microsoft's put together for threat detection and threat prevention. So there's a lot of sort of additional benefits that you would get just by hosting in Azure that would have nothing to do with Windows Server or SQL Server. That would be strictly based on having the network traffic go through their infrastructure. Okay, so when we're looking at the options, this is kind of just summarizing what we've already been talking about. So if you have transactional databases, the options you have available for migration are mainly Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure SQL Database, or moving to an on-prem server. If you're looking at an Azure VM, you can operate any SQL Server database off of an Azure VM, but you're going to absorb the cost of managing that VM. And then when we shift to analytical, you're kind of looking at a different replacement pattern. So if you have an on-premise analytical server where you're hosting data warehousing databases or perhaps analysis services, you're looking at the best path is to leverage an Azure service to provide that as a platform. So it's really easy to migrate analysis services from an on-prem SSAS instance up to Azure Analysis Services. If you're curious how easy it is, I would recommend you to try it. The hardest part is going to be the connectivity if you don't have your data in Azure as well. And even that is not very difficult. There is no actual change that you're likely going to need to make to your analysis services cubes, to your tabular models to move them into Azure Analysis Services. It's a really smooth migration pattern. And then Azure SQL Data Warehouse is significantly improved over a single SQL Server on-prem, or even a cluster of SQL servers on-prem. Azure SQL Data Warehouse is not just a massive database that you can put data in, it's a parallel platform. So you can do a lot of advanced sharding of your data across multiple nodes that enable your queries to execute very quickly, that can be optimized for any type of workload that you're looking for. And you have a lot of control whenever you're looking at loading a data warehouse as far as where that data that you're loading goes, how many nodes it gets loaded to, based on how you structure your tables. So there's a lot of really cool features in Azure SQL Data Warehouse that are only available in Azure SQL Data Warehouse. The closest thing on-prem to the Azure SQL Data Warehouse architecture is the MPP environments where you're looking at an entire rack full of hardware to set up that massively parallel processing environment. So it's an excellent read if you're curious about what's available and the differences between Azure SQL Data Warehouse to an on-prem SQL Server. There are a lot of performance benefits you can realize by moving to that parallel environment. And then finally, your on-premise upgrades are pretty straightforward. So the recommended version for all of these migrations is going to go to SQL Server 2017. And that's only because this presentation is in April. Later this year, SQL Server 2019 will be released. So if your timeline puts you towards the end of the year and you have the capacity to evaluate the 2019 features, you can go and find the release candidate and you can evaluate the new features and test your application in 2019 prior to GA, which is when the general availability of SQL Server 2019 comes into effect. But as it stands today, the version that you'd be looking at least from a recommended best practice, is the latest version. This is the most bang for your buck. This gives you the longest amount of time until you need to look at a migration effort again. So you can be hosting these databases and these workloads for a very manageable amount of time for the cost of a migration. Moving to a SQL Server 2016 or even 2014 or 2012, you're gonna be back here revisiting this migration in the near future. Plus, the feature set that's in 2017 again includes a lot of optimizations and features that aren't available in the earlier versions. And some of the features to look at if you are working in Azure, or if you're looking to set up a hybrid environment or even migrate to Azure in the future, are some of the features around Polybase. The ability for SQL Server to write data into Azure without having external services involved. So you can configure SQL Server to allow you to move data into blob storage and pull data out of blob storage. Really opens up the door on a lot of neat integration patterns. So things where you might have an SSIS package in place today to move data from server A to server B to server C. You can use Polybase to use blob storage as sort of a holding ground. So each server would be pushing or pulling their data from blob storage. You're not looking at linked servers to make them be able to talk. It's more of a hub and spoke model. So somebody publishes and as many people as you care about can consume that data. And it's gonna sit in your blob storage, which is really cheap storage, and it's gonna sit there for as long as your pattern allows it to. So you could store a large history of your incremental processing workloads. And it's really great once it's in storage for loading into other Azure services. So again, some new features in 2016, 2017 that you can leverage. And if you're here today, I'm just assuming that you've got at least one server that's on 2008 and that you're not realizing some of these new features. So if that's not the case, then I apologize. But okay, so all of the options we've been looking at are broken down into two big choices. Do you move into Azure with your database workloads, or do you stay on premise? That's probably the first question you should ask. In order to make that determination, you should be looking at the benefits you get from moving to Azure, because there are significant benefits above and beyond on-premise systems. But if you're not already in Azure, that is an additional scope that you'd be bringing into your migration effort. So again, every great benefit has some cost associated with it, or else it's you should be skeptical of it. So these are some of the key points to look at whenever you're trying to evaluate, do we migrate to Azure or do we stay on-prem? And so we've talked about most of these. The only one that we haven't really dove into is the Azure hybrid benefit. And so with SQL Server and with software assurance from Microsoft, you can extend the cost that you've already spent on SQL licenses to receive a benefit from hosting those SQL servers in Azure. So when you go into Azure and you go to host a server, if you choose a SQL Server based template, part of the monthly cost is going to include licensing for that server. And you can essentially get a discount for the bulk of that cost by using an Azure hybrid benefit, which lets you leverage the licenses that you already have in those Azure VMs without looking at buying new licenses. So it's kind of complicated. I don't want to dive too much into the licensing today because it's very complex and it changes frequently. I'm happy to talk through the current licensing options and some of the things to look at and how you can look at licensing your environment in a discovery or a call after the session today. And if we have time in the Q&A, then I can talk to some of those questions as well, if that's the reason that you're here. I apologize. I have a whole slide here on hybrid benefits. So we're going to share the recording afterwards, and so you can come and kind of see this slide. But these are some of the benefits that you can get from the Azure hybrid offering. So look through these. Again, it's mostly what we've already talked about, that you can leverage your existing licensing to make that move into Azure and to host your SQL Server in a VM in Azure without paying for additional licenses. And there's another slide here that talks about the same benefit which is available for Windows Server because January, the Windows Server 2008 is end of life. So if you're hosting SQL Server on top of Windows Server, you're looking at potentially 2 migration efforts if you don't take these both into account at the same time. So be wary that you would want to look at your Windows Server environment as well as your SQL Server environment, and understand that here's some benefits that you can get moving into Azure for Windows Server as well. Okay, so we're tracking good on time. That's good. So the bulk of the presentation is going to be on the approach. We've talked about what you can do now. We've talked about why you would do it. Let's see how you can do it, which may be the reason that most people are here today. So these are the common questions that we encounter whenever we're looking at a migration. When we're talking to someone that's reaching out for help with a migration effort. And the questions here, how do we identify the necessary capacity to support our workloads? And that's a difficult question if you aren't baselining and already at the point where you understand your capacity. So the question is, if I don't know how utilized all of my systems are or how integrated they are, how do I know what I need once I move? So there's different options when you go to Azure, for example. If you want to choose of the VM you want, so you need to pick what type of VM. Is it an A, B, C? What type of horsepower it has? And then understanding the capacity can be a challenge. Also, moving into some of the Azure platform services, you're looking at things called DTUs, which are going to be your cost model. That's what you're actually paying for when you use an Azure database. And so those are a little bit amorphous in what they represent. And so a lot of the questions we get are, how do I understand, based on the hardware and the workload that I have today, what I need to start with when I go to spin up these Azure platform services? And so we can help with some tools and some analysis to go to clarify that. And then we talked to people and they said that there's so many options, we don't know what the correct architecture is based on what we've got today. And SLAs and the availability, the recovery and security and compliance all factor into that. And there are a lot of choices. We talked about, I think, 4 or 5 different services that apply for moving a database server. So we can help navigate what architectural decisions would lead you into one path or the other. And there's some things that are going to be kind of on you to decide, and there's some things we can guide you with. But the key thing to look at when you're trying to answer this question are, first, what are the constraints? Are you doing anything that prevents you from making the shift into Azure SQL database? And if yes, can you do it in Azure Managed Instance? And if you can't, then you're really stuck. You're kind of looking at a rehost, or you're looking at changing how your database architecture is set up. And there's a cost with both of those. So understanding those costs and how lengthy a refactor may be involved is something that is a common question we get. And it's a hard question. It's something I'm not going to be able to shine a great light on in an hour webinar. So it's the kind of thing where if you have questions about that, please submit them in chat. We can help with, and there's a slide later where we show the tooling that's available to at least gather the information you need in order to make that determination. And then how do we minimize downtime during the migration? So migrating is wonderful, but migrating a production system involves downtime, which is usually something that you don't want. So setting up a migration plan that minimizes the amount of time your production system is down is something that we do a lot. And it's a challenge depending on the complexity of your system. And it's also a challenge depending on the type of system you have. If it's like a back-end timesheet system and it's only used during 9 to 5 hours, yeah, the downtime window you have is essentially overnight, which is a pretty substantial downtime window. If it's a live database that's taking credit card processing requests where people are literally not sending you money while you're down, then yeah, minimizing downtime has a literal impact on your revenue. So that's an important distinction. And the more scaffolding you can do to minimize downtime, usually you're looking at a higher cost migration because you're doing a lot of things to reduce the downtime. You're adding scope to pulling a database off of server A and moving it to server B. And there's a lot of patterns out there for that. So you can do things like log shipping, you can do things like clustering, adding nodes, migrating nodes. You can look at full backups, differential backups. You could look at a bunch of options, replication. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can chew through there to move data from server A to server B. Which approach you take is likely dependent upon your downtime window, the availability you have for your folks during a migration. So what type of expertise is in your company, as well as, what's the cost of the downtime versus the cost of the migration scope. So then another question that our database deployments are challenging. So this is usually not something we can solve with a migration, but optimizing deployments can be used to migrate. So if you have optimized a deployment mechanism for your databases, you can save a lot of effort in a migration by utilizing those same tools to take a database and put it under source control and have that be a deployable unit with automation that lets you spin up a new instance and pull in all of the data from an existing instance and retire your existing instance. So those types of things, while they're typically fall in the DevOps sort of arena, they apply to migrations as well. If that is something you're looking to do, that's certainly an option. You can spin up a new instance with a new hardware configuration as you spin down your old instance with the old unsupported versions. So it's also good because if you don't want to get in the game of reevaluating migrations in the future from a downtime or a deployment mechanism, building the ability to upgrade your instance as a function of your deployment is something that you can do. It's challenging and it has a cost, but it's something that you can do. So you can say with each deployment, I want to deploy into this environment, and it may define what the state you want is. So I want a VM that has this type of architecture. I want Windows Server this specific version. I want SQL Server this specific version. It needs to be installed. I want to deploy these databases. They put files on these disks and these arrays. So there's a lot of options you have to optimize your deployment mechanisms that can apply to a migration. So we put the question in here because it sets the stage for some of those conversations. And if you're already having those conversations, we can look at leveraging some of the work that needs to be done from the migration to enhance your deployment pipelines in the future. Then how do we monitor? So we talked about new services, and if those services are truly new to your organization, then there's a knowledge gap. There's something that you're going to need to fill in order to provide a production-ready application. You don't want to move to Azure SQL Database if you have no idea what to do if somebody reports a performance issue. You don't want to make that jump blindly. So we can help with the tooling that's available. We can help with a lot of the options you have in Azure for unifying your monitoring and bringing all of your concerns from a performance, security, and usage under one roof. And there's a lot of things there, and there's some tools that we've included later that you can also review what our recommendations are to analyze performance and to look at security and usage. So we would like to engage with everyone to help provide some knowledge, but later on in the presentation, we are sharing sort of the tooling that we use. So if you are the kind of company that wants to do this internally and you don't engage, there are still some things here in the deck that'll help you move forward. And the last question is, if you've got people, it kind of ties into the previous question, but if you have people that are really good people, they understand your business, they understand the politics, both internal and external, in your vertical, those are people you want to keep. So maybe getting them ramped up to speed with newer technology is something that's been on your plate for a while. So a migration effort is it's not necessarily related to learning, but it can be. So if you're going to look at Azure services, if you want to evaluate, if you want to go through an assessment to see what options you have, part of that assessment is going to involve subject matter experts. And so if we're looking at that, one of the things we always like to say is, if you've got our time, use it. So sharing the knowledge we have is something that we're very, very willing to do. We don't want to maintain your systems, or we don't want to own your SLAs moving forward. So you guys need to be able to do that. And part of our job in exposing some of the options you have is also helping expose where you can go to get that knowledge. And so any of your trusted Microsoft partners are a great place for that. Microsoft has a lot of documentation that they offer. And there's also other services that that are learning services like a LinkedIn Learning, for example, that have great videos that are sort of shortened that time it would take to onboard these new skills and to extend the capabilities of the folks you have today. So here's our general approach, and I've kind of hinted at some of this, but this is the 3 phases that we've identified that apply to almost every migration effort we've done. And the first phase is the key phase. This is where you're making decisions. And you're not going to make all of your decisions, but you're going to make the bulk of your decisions in the first phase. And this is when you're going to assess your existing environment. And the thing to look at is the output of this phase. Your assessment is essentially complete when you've got a plan in place that will take you from your current state to your future state. So it will take me from all of the applications I have running on the servers that I need to decommission to the future state, which is all of my applications running in the new platform where they're going to live after I decommission the existing system. So in order to go from where you're at today to a realized migration plan, there's several steps. And so these are pretty, these are pretty obvious, but this is kind of the order that we look at. Gather the information, which includes the features you're using today. Determine how that constrains you for your options moving forward, so that you're really evaluating what's feasible, not necessarily everything that's possible, but what's feasible. And then once you've made some decisions about the platform you're going to host in, whether it's Azure or on-prem, then a new version of SQL Server comes with new features, and those features should be evaluated during the migration effort so that you can understand what is there today that wasn't there previously. What will be there tomorrow that isn't there today that I can leverage? So things like the query plan, the query store are new in 2016, 2017. And if you're in the business of monitoring databases that are running production workloads, that's something that you would want. It really cuts out a lot of time in troubleshooting. Understanding what it is, what it does, what its limitations are, should be done during the early phases of a migration. You don't want to move to production and then figure out how to keep it running. And then finally, you actually have to plan the migration. So we've got to go through and say, all right, you picked these are your choices with where you want to move. Now we've got to figure out what are the nuts and bolts that have to get put in place to go from current state to future state. And so while that sort of last chevron is a big concern, it's not necessarily significantly bigger than all of the other steps. It gets big if you start to look at a re-architect that has a lot of features that or a lot of issues that you've got to remediate. But it's not necessarily huge if you're going to be upgrading on-prem and you're going to be looking at moving from 2008 to 2016, within your data center. So again, the scope or the size of the assessment phase is going to be dependent upon your current environment. But the outcomes of that phase, whoever does it, us, another partner, or yourselves, should be an authored migration plan that's documented, that's going to say here's current state, future state, and here's how we're going to go between the two. And that lets you kick off the second main phase, which is actually doing the migration. And so while these are sort of stacked top to bottom and they indicate that you would do an assessment, then a migration, then an optimize, there's parts of the optimize that we've called out, specifically training and understanding how you're going to manage and monitor these environments that you might need to do before your migration or during your migration. So we've separated these efforts because they typically they involve drastically different types of work, but assessment is the key prerequisite. You need to do the assessment first, then you can look at both migration and optimization at the same time. Or you can do an optimization pass and then a migration pass. There's a lot of options you have, excuse me, once you're at the point where you know where you're going and you know how you're going to get there, then you can understand how you can support it once it gets there. So let's focus on migration first. Any issues that were found that you need to remediate. So let's say you've got a few things that you're doing today that aren't supported in the new version, which is a possibility. I don't think the migration path from 2008 to 2017, if you're going to rehost on-prem, has a lot of features that you're losing. But if you're looking at an Azure solution, you're looking at Azure SQL Database, there's a lot of things you can do with an on-premise server that you can't do with a platform service. And so understanding those issues and then understanding the effort to remediate those issues is something to look at as a part of your migration phase. And so once you've got the issues remediated, now you're looking at doing the migration. We're going to run through this migration. We're going to spin up the environment. We're going to move, a copy of whatever we have, either production or test data, out there, and we're going to have our applications hit it. So we're going to move to the new environment. We're going to make sure that we're not losing an application as a part of the move. I'm not going to move to a place where something I have that's legacy can't interact with it. And so this is a key step, and it's a step that's often overlooked, is that testing the migration and validating the migration are very big efforts, and they're very important. And any sort of work or corners that you cut in these phases are high risk for a bad migration night. And I'm saying this from experience, not trying to preach to the choir, but we've always looked at validation as the most important part of a migration. So it's great that you have the plan. It's great that you can move to the new version, but you also can't move to the new version with a larger outage window than you intend because things don't go smoothly. So it's a key stage, and it's something that we've worked through in the past. We've seen a lot of the problems in the past. I'm sure anyone else that's done this has seen those problems as well. But we highlight those as two separate. So testing the migration and then validating it are two things. You actually will bounce back and forth between those two typically. So the way we would operate is we would test and we would validate. We'd identify the issues, and we'd go back to remediate issues. And we would test and we would validate, we would identify, and eventually you have no issues. Your migration's smooth. And then we would test and validate, and we would run through the step-by-step migration plan to validate not only that the process works, but that the plan steps work in the order that they're described. And once you know that you can have a successful migration is when you should finalize your schedule. You're probably going to need to schedule this a little bit ahead of time with some ambiguity, but you want to finalize your schedule and ultimately do a go live. And so that finalizing schedule is called out because if you have an application that's user facing and you have users outside of your organization, so you're not looking at a back office application, you're looking at a website, or you're looking at a credit card processing platform or APIs, you're looking at scheduling with outside vendors and with users potentially. I'm going to be down between X and X on this day because you don't want someone to attempt to use your system while it's out and assume the worst. And so the key deliverable of this is obviously you've done the migration, you've migrated to the new environment. And in the optimization phase, we've talked about a lot of this, as we go. So I'll try to move through this pretty quickly, but you're looking at enabling your team to monitor the new environment. You have to manage the new environment. So you have to understand if you're moving to the Azure platform, how do you track your costs? How do you look at cost to date and see if you're trending to have, a surprise bill at the end of the month? Let's say your usage is now through the roof. You've got to understand and have some alerts in place to see that so that you can get ahead of that. You can avoid those surprise bills. You can understand, I have something that was supposed to turn off at 9 o'clock every night. Maybe it's a dev instance, and that's for some reason we disabled that schedule. And now we're running our devs 24/7 instead of for 8 hours a day. That's going to blow your costs out. So there's a lot of things to look at in the optimization and in Azure. Some of these are shorter efforts if you're looking at an on-prem solution. And then finally, if you're looking for training or mentoring or any assistance in absorbing new features or new capabilities, we would call that part of the optimize phase. So I've been mentioning tooling. So each of these phases is going to have some tools that we would leverage because we're not going to come in and say, I'm just going to spend a couple weeks, look at your systems and see what's happening. We're going to use some tools that enable that to be a very constrained process, and that's going to be something where we get a deliverable out of the assessment. So there's an Azure Migrate service that you can use in order to understand how to migrate from an on-premise to Azure. And there's a lot of features in that service. That service is pretty complex, but that's a service that we would use, and that would be used in likely both the assess and the migrate phase. And then you've got migration assistance for both databases and for SQL Server. And the difference between those is going to be sort of what your target environment is going to be. And those are great tools for listing out all of the features that you're using today that won't work in the target environment. So there's also an upgrade assistant that I didn't list here that lets you say, if I'm going from 2008 to 2016, are there any features in an on-prem install that are being deprecated that I'm using? And so there's tooling that you can use to take some of the guesswork out of the equation. Same thing in the migrate phase. There's a bunch of services available. The key one for us being SQL Server migration is the database migration service, which will let you use some tools to pull your databases and push them to Azure. And so you don't have to do as many custom features to get data up there. It's really nice for moving the data you have and making that migration pretty short from a from a technology perspective. You don't need to build a service to move your data. You can leverage the service they already have. And then finally, for the optimized Azure Security and Management and Azure Monitor specifically are some of the tools that are available that can really bring together all of the different concerns you have with all of the various resources that you may be using in Azure, and let you monitor and set up alerts and set up responses and process around keeping those systems up, maintaining those systems being capable for production workloads, and making sure that they're healthy. So I've listed here, and we talked about this when we were looking at the previous slide, so I'm going to kind of breeze through these next few slides for the sake of time. But so here are the things that are part of an assessment, and some of the deliverables and some of the things you should put in your migration plan. Same thing from your migration stage and your optimized stage. So again, these will be available. I'll kind of go back here and I'll leave the screen on it for a minute so that you have a chance to pause if you're looking at the video. But I don't want to dive through and reread this slide to you because all of these points we've covered while we were talking about the assess, migrate, and optimize approach. And then finally, the optimize stage. And so optimize should be looked at as both post-go live support, training, and ongoing support. So there's a lot of things you can do, and I kind of want to highlight this a little bit. From a digital transformation perspective, if you're looking at moving into Azure, or you're looking at something that's hybrid, there's on top of the database services, there's 1.5 million Azure services that really can extend the capabilities of your organization, and they're very manageable to onboard. So these services are configured in such a way, at least the platform services, that using them, going from nothing to something is not a huge step. Going from a fully embedded data center on-prem to a full data center in Azure is a healthy effort. But if you're moving your databases as part of your migration effort, tacking on something like Azure Search or Databricks to do some analysis, or some machine learning or some AI workloads, well, it sounds complicated. Once your data is there, it really opens the door for investigating these new services. So from a digital transformation perspective, that's an offering that we have, regardless of whether we're doing your migration assessment, what have you. We have a sort of a wing of our company that works with you at a very high level to understand how can we go from where we're at to where we want to be to maintain our cutting edge related to technology. And it's usually not an easy conversation. So we have kind of a few subject matter experts that aren't specifically one technological area versus another. They sit more on the organizational structure. How do I make my organization, or how do I transform my organization to be able to adopt these new services? How do I adjust our culture? How do I adjust our mindset? And how do we move forward to stay competitive with companies like Amazon that are really kind of absorbing every vertical that's out there slowly. So just something I wanted to call out in our offerings. It's not related to a migration, but it is related to the benefits you can get post-migration. Okay, and so that's the bulk of the content. The last thing I wanted to call out is that in order to move forward, or if you want us to assist you, we're a Microsoft Gold partner. We do these sorts of workloads a lot. We do a lot of custom application development. We have architects in almost every subject area in the Microsoft stack, and we are very good at talking to you and helping you navigate this process. So specifically, all of the questions across the top: why do we upgrade? How do we upgrade? What do we do if we want to try Azure or get a proof of concept? And then how do we grow how do we grow our technology footprint as a company? How do we extend our capabilities to the things, the hot button terms, or the cool things that we hear other people doing? How do we get to the point where we can do those too? And so please reach out to Stephanie Musser. Here's all of her contact information, and she will schedule a call with whoever is the best subject matter expert to handle whatever your specific concerns are. So this takes us to Q&A. So I'll kind of kick it back over to Nick and see. First, thank you for staying on the line here and listening to me talk. Webinars are interesting. I kind of like sitting in a room with everyone better because I can kind of see if you're nodding off or getting bored. But you know, this is good. This is an easy way to reach out to a bunch of people, and this is minimally impactful to your days. So hopefully there was some value that we delivered. And if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat window, and Nick will call them out, and we'll kind of open them up for discussion.
All right, let's give it 1 minute to see which questions come in. Okay, Steve, in terms of migration, what do you think the 1 or 2 most common pitfalls are to migrating?
Most common pitfalls? From my experience, the most common pitfalls are putting a bunch of effort into migrating that your services work in a new environment, and then not putting the proper testing in making sure that you can make the move in the window that you've allocated. So leaving unknowns for go live night, not setting up a test environment that matches your production environment to do a full real test of that migration. So that's something that I can say most of the migrations that we've been called into or that we've seen that we haven't driven, maybe we've assisted in some parts of the effort, but not the entire effort. Most of the downside or most of the failures we see are not necessarily related in the services. Everyone has a pretty good idea of understanding, does my application work in the new environment? But there's a lot of challenges related to moving into a new environment that are sometimes overlooked. Things like firewall or networking, things like bandwidth, things like scheduled job activity on other wings of the company at a certain time of night that slow your network down and extend your window. A lot of unknowns that are hard to bullet point out, but that we have seen over time that are related to testing them in one place, in one mechanism, and then actually making the move using a different mechanism or in a different type of environment.
All right, and a similar question, Steve, what pitfalls, if any, do you see with upgrading with an on-prem server?
So for clarification, an upgrade, are you indicating an in-place upgrade, or upgrade is in moving from 2008 on-prem to a new server with 2016 on-prem? Okay, so I'll talk about both. So with the in-place upgrade,
New server,
awesome. So moving to a new server, really the pitfalls are going to be things that you aren't aware of, things that exist that tie into that server that you didn't even realize were touching that server. The same things are going to apply to any migration effort. So I don't know if this is specific to on-prem, but a lot of times when a database server lives for, I think how long ago did 2008 come out? What, 10 years now? So in 10 years, there have been a number of things that are now going to interface with that server that maybe lived for a short period of time. Maybe you turned them on, then you turned them off. Maybe you haven't used them in 5 years, and then all of a sudden tomorrow somebody says, oh wait, we used to have this thing, can we turn it back on? So with a migration, any migration, not necessarily specific to moving from on-prem to on-prem, the biggest thing to look at, aside from a botched execution in the migration, is the things you aren't aware of. What is using that server that you don't know, and it's hard to evaluate that for things that don't have a steady stream of traffic, or that have very or maybe somebody's pet project they've had off for 2 years. So even if you looked at everything that connected in any way, shape, or form to that server over a 6-month period of time, there's still a chance that you could miss a few things. As far as the technical, really migrating from an on-prem server to an on-prem server gives you the new features in SQL Server. It gives you it gives you a bunch of benefits, but the drawbacks are only that you're going to be looking at another migration effort in another X number of years. So I don't know if I actually called it out, and I kind of feel bad about this now, but the platform services, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure SQL Database that we talked about, those are upgraded for you. You don't run migrations for those in the future. Those are upgraded behind the scenes as new versions come out. What you're looking at when you move to one of those services is not necessarily upgrading your infrastructure in the future. It's upgrading your feature sets. So if I'm using a feature that's no longer available, when it's going to be deprecated, that's what I would need to upgrade. I wouldn't be migrating to a new instance or a new service or a new version. Those features in the new versions are just going to become available as they're released from Microsoft. So again, I don't know if it's a pitfall of migrating on-prem, but it's something that you'd be looking at another migration if you stayed on-prem. It's kind of like the easy decision, but it's not necessarily the right decision. So it's easy to say, all right, well, this is how I'm doing it today. Let me just throw a new server out there and move over. That's easy from a thought capital. Like, you don't have to spend a lot of time doing evaluations and assessments. But the downside is you're going to be doing it again. And you're going to have to keep doing it. And every time that you have to do it, you're going to be looking at a different set of challenges. You're going to be looking at a different set of staff. I don't know about you. Actually, this is the first time in which I've been at a company for more than 10 years in a single stretch, being here at CEI. But again, that's not typical. So you're going to be looking at new staff. You're going to be looking at new capabilities, and you're going to be looking at some unknowns that maybe you're not aware of. So again, I hope it answered your question. But that's sort of my go-to is to say I would evaluate Azure both from the services that you get, from the performance that you can gain, as well as from the manageability. Those are going to be updated instances. They're given to you in a in a managed state. You don't have to do some of this ongoing effort. And those are some of the hidden costs that are not usually included when I've seen people evaluate, does it make sense for us to move to a cloud service? A lot of times a migration effort is something that gets added on to the cost of moving to the service, never gets added on to the benefit of not having to do that migration again.
All right, so Steve, those are all the questions we have at this point. I would say we're about ready to wrap up. Any closing comments for the group before we end the webinar?
Really just thank you for your time. And again, please reach out to Stephanie if there's any additional questions you have that we can answer, or if there's, if we can set up a call, if you want us to help you with this effort, to help you navigate any of the options we talked about today. We're happy to do so.
Excellent. Well, Steve, thank you very much for sharing today. We appreciate it. Thank you to everyone on the phone. And with that, we'll close down the webinar. Have a great day.